Well, today is the third Sunday of Easter, in which we continue to celebrate the resurrection. In today's gospel reading, we're going to hear another story of Jesus appearing to his disciples after his death. Even though the apostles are locked in a room together, Jesus is seemingly able to walk through the walls like some kind of ghost. So what really happened that day? Well, some of you may remember a few years ago that we took part in a progressive Christian Bible study together called Living the Questions. In that DVD series, a variety of leading progressive Christian theologians shared their thoughts on a variety of topics, including the resurrection. Of the resurrection, UCC pastor Reverend Robin Meyers said in the series that resurrection is not about beam me up, Scotty. It's not about molecules disappearing and then reappearing. All that is hocus pocus. We don't believe in Santa Claus anymore. We don't believe in the tooth fairy. We should not believe in beam me up, Scotty as an explanation for Easter. And in the same series, Bishop John Shelby Spong said, if the resurrection of Jesus cannot be believed except by assenting to the fantastic descriptions included in the Gospels, then Christianity is doomed. For that view of resurrection is not believable. And if that is all there is, then Christianity, which depends upon the truth and authenticity of Jesus' resurrection, also is not believable. So what are we to make of the resurrection stories in the gospel? Well, that's what we're going to explore together today during today's service. Well, I'm not ashamed to admit that one of the TV shows we watch a lot in our house is Judge Judy. If you've ever watched her show, you know that plaintiffs and defendants in the courtroom often bring witnesses with them to testify on their behalf. And Judge Judy often says to these witnesses, tell me what you saw. Tell me what you heard. And sometimes the witness will say, well, I myself wasn't actually there, but someone told me what happened. And Judge Judy always says, well, I can't allow that testimony in my courtroom. That testimony is not admissible in court because you're giving me secondhand testimony, and that is hearsay. Therefore, you are not a reliable witness. Now, I share that with you this morning because in the gospel reading from today's lectionary, Jesus utters the phrase, you are witnesses. But what does he mean by this? Well, we hear a lot in Christian circles today about witnessing and testifying for Christ. But you know, some of those who are testifying today are not reliable witnesses. Some Christians in America today are giving us hearsay, testimony that they heard from someone else. They are not giving us a first-hand account, but a second or third-hand account. So, for example, they'll tell us that Christ is risen because they read about it in the Bible or because they heard about it in church, not because they experienced it for themselves firsthand. Remember when you were a kid and you would play the game called telephone? Someone would whisper a story to one person, and that person would whisper it to another person, and so on down the line. And by the time it got to the end of the line, the story had changed. That, my friends, is the history of Christianity. Over 2,000 years ago, the apostles had a first-hand experience of the risen Christ, and that story has been passed on for centuries. The resurrection stories in the Gospels were not first-hand accounts. The Gospel writers were not eyewitnesses to these events. In fact, they wrote these stories decades after Jesus had died. Their purpose for writing these stories wasn't to give us a factual account of what happened, but to inspire us. I've told you before, the Bible isn't a history book, but a guidebook. The purpose of the spiritual life isn't to gather second or third-hand knowledge about Christ from a book. The purpose of the spiritual life is for us to experience the risen Christ firsthand for ourselves. So my question for you this morning on the third Sunday of Easter is, do you believe Christ is risen because you read about it in the Bible or because you heard about it at church? Or do you believe in the risen Christ because you have experienced it for yourself firsthand? Many Christian witnesses today are not giving us firsthand knowledge of the risen Christ. They're giving us hearsay. They're not reliable witnesses. We know of many politicians and televangelists in America today who claim to be Christian witnesses, but whose policies and behaviors are in sharp contrast to the way of Jesus. I do not believe that they have firsthand knowledge of the Christ. We in the UCC Church witness not only in our words alone, but also in our actions. On the sign hanging in the entrance of our church, it says, "We believe that the fullest expression of our belief is our actions." Other Christian churches witness and testify in their words in order to evangelize and to convert people to their religion. But you know, Jesus never instructed us to convert people to a particular religion. Jesus was Jewish. He was a very devout Jew. So if you want to convert people to the religion of Jesus, then convert them to Judaism. Jesus asks us not to convert others, but to convert ourselves, to transform ourselves, not to a religion, but to a way of life, a way of unconditional love for all people, a way of service to the least of these, a way of forgiveness to those who have wronged us, a way of justice and peace. When we live this way of life, we experience firsthand knowledge of the Christ. We become witnesses to the divine presence in our midst. Have you ever experienced the presence of God in your midst? If so, what did you see? What did you hear? Where and when did you experience the divine? Maybe it was when you were rocking a newborn baby, or when you were petting your cat. Maybe it was when you were watching the sunset on the beach, or holding the hand of a loved one as they took their last breath. When we share those resurrection stories with one another and with the world, we are witnessing and testifying about the Christ. The word witness comes from the Latin root word wit, which means knowledge. And I've told you before, knowledge doesn't mean intellectual knowledge. It's about intimacy, knowledge of the heart. To be a witness of God means you have firsthand knowledge of God, intimacy with God, oneness with God. It means you have experienced the divine in your midst, with you and within you. Today's gospel story reminds us that the risen Christ wasn't just a spirit or a ghost, but a body. Notice in the story, the risen Jesus asks for some food to eat. The risen Jesus invites the apostles to touch his hand and his side. This reminds us that the experience of the risen Christ is not about connecting with a ghost, but is experienced in the physical body, in us and through us. Many of us growing up in the Christian church heard that the body was bad, and many spiritual people think that we need to transcend the body. But remember, Scripture tells us that the Word was made flesh and that the body is the temple of the Spirit. We experience the divine in smiles and hugs, in eating good food, in listening to the birds singing. And we are called to witness Christ among us, not just in the spiritual, but in the physical. And so, during this season of Easter, this time where we celebrate the risen Christ, may you witness more fully the presence of the divine in the physical world, in nature, in one another, and within yourself. May your humanity and your divinity meet and experience oneness, wholeness, resurrection, and new life.